This podcast features criminologists discussing sensitive themes and topics. Listener discretion is advised. A young woman is brutally murdered. The identity of her perpetrators would shock a community and a nation. This is the Reena Virk story. Well, Amy, before we get started today, I'd just like to point out, in case you didn't already realize, that today's episode is our 200th one.
Oh, we should be celebrating.
Well, I mean, yes and no, because, we're about to cover a very serious topic, but right? 200 episodes. Wow.
Yes.
When I saw that, I was like, oh my gosh, we're really fortunate. Remember when we started this endeavor, it's like you really hope your podcast is going to be impactful and it's going to go somewhere and you're going to last. But we're here for 200 episodes and I feel so grateful.
To think about all of those episodes, all the hours we spent together. Also to think about how far we've come in terms of studio setup. Do you recall the first studio we rented space in?
Of course, in Jersey City. I mean, the stories we have from that place.
Right? Weren't there mice and rats and stuff?
We stood on chairs while mice crawled around us. What else happened to you?
Oh my God. I just remember I had to go to urgent care because I scratched myself on like a rusty nail.
Yeah.
And remember, actually, the doctor and nurse became listeners.
Yes, you had to get a tetanus shot.
Yes.
Remember the heat didn't work, so we had to wear like our gloves, our mittens all winter, the first winter. And then in the end, the studio burned down.
I'm sorry?
I mean, this was quite
Everyone's
a thing.
okay. I'm assuming it's
yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
But those were the days. We've come quite far.
And then during COVID, we started doing it remotely during COVID. Yeah. And then that kind of unfortunately, it set us on a path of doing more remote. We used to always do in person, which was really nice, but at least we could be a little more productive when we don't have to physically be in the same room.
Yeah, I think that it's incredible how far we've come. And while we hope to be here for, many more 100 episodes, there's tragedies connected to them. Mm-hmm. I think the silver lining that we find in our podcast is the issues that we get to discuss and the victims that we get to highlight and the awareness that we get to spread. I feel like that work is just such a positive outcome, at least of what we do.
I agree. We get countless emails about people who are maybe looking at their professions a little differently or going into different professions than they had initially planned to. So, yeah, if we can just spread awareness on some of these issues, on getting the word out on some of these victims, things that people can do.
Yeah, and if we can inspire any of the types of listeners that we have to go into the field, that's exactly what we want, right? Like people who really, really care and they're passionate. And we see that happen with our listeners all the time. And I'm really grateful. So happy 200th before we get started today.
Yes. Thank you to our listeners who made the 200th possible.
Absolutely. Okay, today's case is one that we also received a lot of listener emails and suggestions about. So I can tell you that it also has recently become a series on Hulu called Under the Bridge. Have you heard of this one?
I have not. No.
Okay, so it's one of those 8-part miniseries. It's dramatic, but it's based on a true story. It centers around the pretty infamous case of Reena Virk. And now I had absolutely heard of Reena's case before. It was certainly one that I thought about covering. Then I watched the show, and of course I did more of a deep dive. And really I wanted to compare also. In dramatic series, I like to look at what's real, what's not, where the differences lie, how they're conveying it, and why they're doing so. So there's been a fair amount of media coverage about Reena's murder, the motives, the culture surrounding the crime, and the possible moral panic at the time in British Columbia, all of which I promise we will discuss. I do want to put a little trigger warning in here that we'll be discussing children assaulting other children, so extra listener discretion is advised. Okay, now I'd like to introduce our listeners to Reena. Born in 1983, Reena Virk was the oldest child of 3 and lived with her parents in Saanich, British Columbia, in a large South Asian Sikh community. For further geographic reference, her community was located in Victoria, which is a mostly middle-class city on Vancouver Island. Reena's mother, Suman, grew up on Vancouver Island with her parents, who moved there when Suman was a child, but it was really hard for them to find a community at the time. So Reena's grandparents joined the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they really found a sense of belonging there. Reena's father, Reena Virk, came from India to visit his sister in Victoria in 1979. And at that time, he met Suman and the two began dating. Now, his plan was to return to India, just so you know, but Majit never left Canada as he ended up marrying Suman and raising their family as Jehovah's Witnesses in Victoria. So he also converted. Now, they were a strict family, abiding by their religious rules, and this was a struggle for Reena, who just wanted to feel the same as her peers. At the time of the events we're discussing, Reena was a young teenager, and so there are a bunch of rules that Jehovah's Witnesses have that prevent certain practices, like they can't celebrate holidays, there's strict clothing for what they can wear, they can't attend events sponsored by other churches, they're discouraged from attending school dances. So this would be understandably hard for a child of Reena's age, you might say.
Especially if there's not other children who practice that religion in her community.
Correct. And they were really a small minority of the community, of an already kind of minority small community, yes. Now, in that regard, you might say Reena was no different than most teenage girls. She just wanted to do the things that normal teenage girls were doing. But in some other major ways, Reena was, or at least felt like, such an outsider. So her strict parents didn't allow Reena much freedom. And in addition to that, Reena was bullied for her appearance, her religion, and perhaps other factors. Reena was a bit overweight, and I know that she did not feel like she fit in physically as well as culturally. So she has multiple factors going on here where she just doesn't feel very comfortable.
Does she have her own little group of friends, though, or is she on her own?
I'm about to get to that.
Okay.
You'll hear. I think it took her a while to find some group of friends. And even when she did, I'm not sure she found the right friends.
Okay.
Now, her feelings about wanting freedom and autonomy only grew stronger as she got older. And around 16 years old, she met a new group of friends who she thought would provide just that. Reena began hanging out with a group of girls, seemingly led by 14-year-old teenager named Nicole Cook at the time of the events that we'll discuss today. As I said before, I think she just struggled to find a group before that.
Now, was this group all younger? Because it sounds like the ringleader's 14 and Reena's 16. What's the rest of the group look like?
That's correct. It looks like the rest of them are kind of mixed, 14,
Okay.
15, 16.
Okay.
So nobody too young, nobody too old. But yes, a little bit younger than Reena because I don't think she found in school her friend group. The girls that Reena met were living in a nearby foster home as well due to different troubles at home with their family members, which I'm sure was very hard on these girls. But it also seemed to provide them with a facade of freedom that Reena found very attractive. Now, what I mean by this is that they seemed to come and go as they please where they resided in a group home, with a curfew being set. You know, I think the curfew was something like 11 o'clock or midnight. It was pretty late. And, well, you might say it was pretty late depending on your upbringing. And I'm not sure that they had much supervision there. You know, it was rule-based. Come in at this time, follow the rules, we'll leave you alone kind of situation is what I gathered. Now, these girls loved rap music. Their favorites were Biggie and Tupac. I don't know how you felt about them, but those were also my favorites.
You know, that was, well, what are we talking? The 90s, you said?
Yes. We're talking about 97 here.
Yeah, some of the best music ever was in the late 90s.
I would agree.
Yes.
What do you think your kids are going to think about that?
No, they like that kind of music.
Fantastic. Good kids they were. I always knew it. Okay, so they idolized rap music and organized crime members like the Gotti family from America, which is very interesting. I think they seemingly thought they were kind of badasses too, and they aspired to become like them. They thought of themselves as like gangster girls in training.
Any of these girls have like juvenile records, do we know?
I mean, they're in a foster home because they had troubles that were both with their families, but also because of some juvenile criminal behavior as well. And they smoked cigarettes, they drank alcohol, they smoked pot, and they kind of had this defiant attitude towards authority. And I think that in many ways, Reena envied them. She was resentful of her parents as well at the time. I think she wanted the lifestyle they had. And so they suggested that there was a way Reena could have it, but it would come at a price to her family. It was shortly after that discussion that Reena accused her father of sexually abusing her in 1996.
This is at the urging of these girls?
At the suggestion, if Reena wanted to get out of her house and wanted to be free, there was a way that she could do so.
Oh.
And that was to report an assault. Now, in doing so, Reena was removed from her home and placed with social services and in foster care pretty quickly.
Was her father arrested?
Yes, he was arrested, and he had to go through the court system. And I have to tell you, Amy, it wasn't very long before Reena realized her big mistake. And I think it was guilt that she felt for what she did to her father, but also that life in foster care, it wasn't all that it seemed. It wasn't endless fun with no supervision, no rules. And in fact, it was kind of a hard and sad and isolated, lonely way to live. Reena also began to experience problems with Nicole, the very girl I think she both idolized and envied at the same time.
So she was now living with these girls.
She was living in a foster care. In the show Under the Bridge, they implied that she was living in the same home as these girls. I'm not sure if she was the entire time, but I do believe there was one main facility on the island. So likely so. I can't say for sure, though.
Okay.
It isn't entirely clear what the issue was between Reena and Nicole. When asked, though, Nicole said she just felt like Reena was really jealous of her and she just wanted to keep her distance from Reena. But apparently Reena took this very hard, or was upset for reasons beyond what we know here. And so in kind of a retaliatory move, you might say, Reena stole Nicole's address book, where she had names and phone numbers and addresses. And unfortunately, what she did with this information would set off a devastating chain of events. Reena called people Nicole knew and began spreading rumors about her, saying some of the following. She told some of Nicole's friends that Nicole had fake breasts. She told some people that Nicole's eyes weren't really so pretty, but she had fake contact lenses. She even told a person on that list, from what we know, that Nicole had contracted HIV or AIDS.
This seems strange to me. Obviously, what she's doing is not right, but it doesn't seem to fit with the goals she's trying to pursue, which is to fit in. It's an interesting move by Reena.
Well, what happened as well is that Reena, I think, she's both, I would say, sensitive and fragile, but also tough. And she didn't like the way she was being outsided now with this group of girls.
Well, good for her, in a way. I mean, good for her for standing up for herself. That's not the right way to go about it, but it's nice that she has a backbone, I guess. I wouldn't have expected that given what we know.
Yes, given like her desire to fit in and whatnot, but I think she was angry about it, and I don't think she was willing to just kind of lay down. But yes, wrong way, of course, to go about it. These are children, though, and they're troubled children. The problem was, when Nicole found out about what Reena did, she was furious. And she set into motion a plan to confront Reena. Meanwhile, Reena had already began to reconnect with her family, and she was trying to work out the issues between them and fix their relationship. So she had withdrawn her abuse accusations, and she was in the reunification process with her family. But unfortunately, Reena would never have the chance to truly reconnect with the people who loved her the most. On the evening of November 14th, 1997, one of the group girls, Missy Pleach, invited Reena to a party by Craigsflower Bridge. Now, this is like a local bridge near a school. It's like the kids hang out. You know how when we were kids, we hung out in gross places like outside?
Yeah, like open fields or,
Exactly. This was by an open field, but it's a pretty gross area, like littered with trash, and it was right near a gorge. I think the water was dirty. Not a place you'd want to hang out.
Well, a place you want to hang out if you're a kid who's trying to be deviant.
That's true. Or just trying to, be able to smoke and drink and be away from your parents. Now, like her issues with Nicole, it seemed that Reena had some problems with Missy as well. It was rumored that Reena may have been having some type of relationship with Missy's boyfriend, but that's not confirmed. No idea if that's true or not, just the rumor here. But regardless, Reena decided to meet up with the girls under the bridge because it was still a hangout. She was still friends with some of them, and this is what kids do, hang out with no supervision behind a local school. Anyway, while Reena was supposed to be hanging out with her family that night, I think maybe she also saw this party as a way to make nice with the girls who she had been having some struggles with. But unbeknownst to Reena, this, quote, party was really a trap. It seemed that Nicole Cook wanted to know exactly why Reena was spreading rumors about her. And when she demanded Reena tell the group that night, Reena stood up and called Nicole a bitch. She could sense what was coming. The girls got Reena there to this party, and all of a sudden, they were surrounding her.
How many girls were there?
It started off as 4.
Okay.
But more. And I think Reena could sense what was coming. She was about to, I think she knew she was about to possibly get attacked.
Mm-hmm.
And this altercation, after Reena called Nicole a bitch, it escalated very quickly as Nicole extinguished a lit cigarette on Reena's forehead.
Ooh.
Now, some say also that this cigarette, the placement of it, was kind of in the middle of her eyes. Some people implied that the placement of this cigarette was meant to disparage or degrade her heritage. That's never really been substantiated or proven. It's just a thought that I've heard out there.
Mm-hmm.
Regardless, from there, things only got much worse. The group, it got bigger, and now at this point consisting of 6 girls plus 1 local boy surrounded Reena and began kicking and beating her. They got her down on the ground while Reena tried crawling away, saying that she was sorry and crying, and she began to bleed very badly.
Were these other teens kind of hiding out and their job was to like jump out, or they just happened upon the scene? Do we know?
They were friends of the group. They were all there that night.
Mm-hmm.
They all hung out there. Even if the plan was to trap Reena, they were all still going to hang out there no matter what.
Mm-hmm.
So there were other girls there, but they knew the group too. In this group, of course, was Nicole Cook and Missy Pleach, as well as Nicole's good friend Kelly Ellard and a lone boy named Warren Glowatsky. Now, a little bit about Warren here, because I said there was only one boy in the group. Warren had a hard background, living on his own for a while and with friends after his parents separated. Warren's mother was an alcoholic, and his father had left them for another woman in the United States. Unfortunately for Warren, his father left, and I believe that his father extended an offer for him to come, but Warren would have to leave Canada, go to the United States, live with this new woman who his father had left him for, and I really don't know the situation. I know that Warren did not want to leave, but he found himself a pretty lost kid. He was a gang member at that time. He was couch surfing, living with person to person, so really not a good scenario for him. Neither was his childhood. Now, this other girl that I mentioned, Nicole Cook's friend Kelly, she had the complete opposite life. A decent home with loving parents whom she lived with, at least from all outward appearances. Of course, we never know what's going on inside, but I will say that she appeared to have some means. She appeared to have a family who was very supportive of her. So a different situation than Warren, you might say, and these girls in foster care. But neither of these two seemed to have any motive to harm Reena at the time. Now back to the assault. This assault, just so you know, I've heard it called a fight so many times, and I would absolutely never categorize an assault by 7 people on one as a fight.
Nope.
But also different times. Anyway, the vicious assault went on for a few minutes, but eventually a very badly injured and bleeding Reena Virk was able to crawl away from them, with the kids losing interest and walking away. You know, their demand for a pound of flesh and a good scene or good entertainment had been satisfied. And so everyone left while Reena basically tried to crawl to safety. Now, everyone seemed to know the attack was over at this point, except for 2 of those kids, and that was Warren Glowatsky and Kelly Ellard. They actually followed Reena as she tried to crawl to safety. And from what was reported, the 2 attacked Reena a second time, kicking and beating her severely again before dragging her down to the water under the bridge.
And these are the 2 that didn't really know her or have much to do with her, correct?
That's correct, which doesn't make sense. And so what happens next is even more shocking. After they dragged her under the bridge down to this water, Kelly then pushed Reena's head into the dirty gorge water and held her there until she drowned, her lungs filling with pebbles.
What?
Yes. And this is a girl with seemingly little motive.
And the other ones had already left at this point. They weren't watching or anything.
That's correct. At this point, when Reena had crawled away, it was just Warren and Kelly who followed. Now, let's move over to Reena's parents. At this point, they were very concerned when she didn't come home that night. and they called the police to report their daughter missing the next morning. They also went to Reena's supposed friends, Missy and Nicole, who said they didn't know where Reena was. I'm not sure at the time they actually did know where Reena was, because Missy and Nicole, they were part of that original attack, but not the second one.
But I'm sure they also didn't offer the information that they had seen her earlier.
Absolutely not, of course not. Or that they brutally assaulted her in a group full of people. No. Now, as we see in many cases, and particularly ones involving young females who have a history of mental illness or family disruption, the police didn't take this quite as seriously at first. I mean, they thought that Reena had run away from home and would likely surface because of the family discord. She had been living in, a foster home. There were allegations in the home, so they just thought this was maybe part of the behavior. Now, we discuss a lot while this is the wrong move, and it certainly is, but I do want to say when there's evidence of this pattern of behavior, we might somewhat understand why an officer might at first make this assumption. So I don't want to say that it's okay, because it's not, but when it fits with the pattern of behavior, it's at least somewhat understandable why this might be an assumption, even if it's one that they really can't afford to make. This is like Saturday, though, and now by Monday at school, Reena hadn't turned up.
Wait, they waited that long?
They took the report. I'm not saying they didn't look into it. I'm saying I don't think they took it as seriously as they could. And yeah, I actually do think they waited that long. You know what? Now that I say it, I don't think they did much.
Well, because they didn't, I'm assuming they didn't do a search. And if they did, it would have been,
no,
they probably would have found her.
No, I don't think they would have. I'll talk about why they might not have found her, but I don't know how many friends they spoke to. I don't know what kind of intel they collected. But I can tell you by Monday, the word was out that Reena had been attacked and likely murdered. Remember, there were tons of witnesses to the attack. And kids talk. So while the police might not have taken it seriously at first, when two young girls called in a tip, thankfully, they set out quickly to investigate and even quicker to make some arrests. So they brought in 8 kids who were allegedly involved in the assault. But at this point, they didn't have Reena. They didn't have her alive or deceased. Just the word of mouth from kid eyewitnesses that Reena had been attacked under the bridge and was now missing for 48 hours. But now they were armed with this information of where the possible assault happened, which they did not have before. So now they called in a dive team to search those dirty waters near the bridge. And unfortunately, the search proved fruitful. They found Reena's badly beaten body in the water 8 days after Reena went missing. So the 2 days turned into making arrests, getting further information, calling in dive teams who did not immediately find Reena either. So again, the water was, I pointed out, very dirty. I don't know how far under she was, but it did take a couple of days to find her. While it was clear that immense harm had been done to Reena upon finding her body, Reena's autopsy would also reveal a lot of shocking information. Her official cause of death was drowning, but Reena had suffered severe injuries to her head and her internal organs that were tantamount to a very bad car crash. And they would have either way caused long-term severe damage, such as paralysis, even if she had not drowned. And even the medical examiner said had she not drowned, she most likely would have died from the beating.
Were there any weapons involved?
No.
Or were they just kicking and hitting?
There might have been rocks, but no weapons brought that we know of.
So this is going to bring up some very interesting legal questions on who's culpable for what.
Yes, absolutely. The most serious injuries clearly came from the second attack by Warren Glowatsky and Kelly Ellard. They were able to deduce that as well by her movement after the fact that she could still walk. Reena's death immediately became big news, with juveniles as the murderers and the cause for panic about young females murdering one of their classmates. This became kind of a media sensation over there. Dubbed the Shoreline Six in the media, the 6 perpetrators who took part in the attack were arrested, along with Warren Glowatsky and Kelly Ellard, and they were all charged with Reena's murder. I want to just go back and correct myself. I had said 7 perpetrators before, and I meant 8, so apologies for that mistake. Now the question became, who was guilty of what? What would happen to these kids for their vicious crimes? And would there really be justice?
I mean, there's going to be a lot of finger pointing here, and I'm assuming it's one kid's word against another kid's. No CCTV.
There was CCTV.
Oh.
They were able to see Reena at one point crawling away from the attack. Unfortunately, there's no CCTV under the bridge, so they weren't able to see the attack here. And I will say, while there was probably finger pointing, it didn't come from the lower level girls, because while they were charged with murder initially, their charges were downgraded to assault causing bodily harm. Once it was determined that the first attack was an assault and caused bodily harm, but did not cause death or some of the most severe injuries.
So I'm surprised they weren't charged with attempted murder, though?
Well, no, I mean, they went from murder to being downgraded. I think they waited for all the medical examiner's information to come in.
Okay.
Also, look, I think the information they got, you'll see, was that these girls definitely did assault Reena, but they were not the main perpetrators, and they were not the ones that the prosecution was after in the end.
Mm-hmm.
They all took pleas, and their sentences ranged from 60 days in jail to 1 year in custody. So I believe they all got 1 year in custody for the assaults with the possibility of getting out in 60 days.
That's not enough.
Okay, but Warren Glowatsky and Kelly Ellard, they pled not guilty because they were being charged with the murder. Warren went to trial first. Despite his not guilty plea, the evidence against him was pretty strong, as his girlfriend at the time testified against him, and his clothes, which were later found in a search of his home, had Reena's blood all over them. Kelly also provided evidence against him in an attempt to mitigate her own guilt and point the finger somewhere else.
Meghan, were they charged as adults?
Kelly and Warren were both charged and tried as adults, yes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think it was a huge surprise in the end when the jury found Warren guilty in 1999. Now, you might say his sentence sounds pretty severe, but listen to it, because it was like, whoa, he was charged as an adult and he was sentenced to life in prison. However, I think because their age is a factor, he had parole eligibility after just 7 years.
7?
Yes, which is why I said that was probably
Whoa.
very surprising.
Wow.
Yes, 7 years is when his first eligibility would come.
Oh, I can't wait till you get to where they are now. I'll wait.
Yes, I know you can't. Okay. He appealed but lost, although he appeared to be very remorseful, just so you know, for his crimes throughout the years. Warren reportedly participated in restorative justice mediation with Reena's parents, to whom he apologized, expressed remorse. And I think that he was really the only one to do so. And Reena's parents believed him. Warren seemed to be, an angry, sad, frustrated kid who possibly was taking out some frustration on a weaker person than him, which we'll obviously discuss in at the end here when we talk about theories. But he did really go through all of the steps in trying to repair the relations with his family or with Reena's family. And I think this went a long way with them, because when he came up for his first day parole eligibility in 2007, Reena's family spoke in favor of release, and he was granted day parole, where he could leave for the day but return to prison at night.
Wow.
And then he was subsequently granted full parole in 2010 after serving about 10 to 11 years of his sentence. And from what I was able to find or not find, he has stayed out of trouble since such time.
Okay.
You might say the more interesting trial or trials were Kelly Ellard's. Kelly admitted to taking part in the original attack on Reena, but not the second attack, placing the blame entirely on her co-defendant and already convicted Warren Glowatsky.
And what did Warren have to say, or he didn't have anything to say?
No, he did. He said that it was actually Kelly who was the aggressor, and that he had said that he had attacked her a second time and he helped, I believe, drag Reena's body into the water, but Kelly was the one who held her underwater. He said that was the part at which he grew terrified. There was good reason to believe him, too. It was actually, in the end, they believed that the two of them were culpable and maybe equally culpable, but Warren was quite remorseful and felt terrible for what he did and seemed to admit to very bad acts while holding to the fact that Kelly was the one who drowned her. He thought that was a step too far. It seemed that even scared him. Not saying that negates anything terrible he did at all.
Yeah.
And then Kelly's defense, so she blamed him. Then she also had an aspect of self-defense, saying that she did it to protect her friend in the beginning. Yeah, that's how it kind of started. But, there was other evidence against Kelly. She had some of Reena's belongings in her possession, clothes and shoes, which certainly did not look good for her when the police searched her home. And there was also the testimony of other witnesses. There was the material found. Kelly was the only one essentially who was saying she didn't do anything wrong, but everyone else kind of said she did.
Mm-hmm.
In the end, Kelly was also found guilty of second-degree murder in the year 2000. But months later, her conviction was overturned on appeal because of questionable testimony from one of the prosecution's witnesses.
Oh, do tell.
So she won an appeal. I don't know what the testimony was exactly, but I do know that it was someone who said that they saw Kelly attacking Reena a second time or following Reena. And when they went back and got down to the core of her testimony, found out she didn't really see that. So that was the testimony. They said that it was too prejudicial.
Okay.
So it appeared there would be a second trial. And there was a second trial.
How is that not seen as harmless? I mean, it seems like there's so much.
Well, the conviction against Kelly, there were multiple people involved. A lot of the testimony came from Warren, who himself was questionable. And I think a lot of the testimony against Kelly was eyewitness testimony. So if it was all eyewitness and this one particular witness's story held so much weight as to bear a conviction,
I see.
you might say that was harmful.
Yeah.
But it's also, remember, this is also not the United States, and the standards might be a little bit different for appeal. So you're going by our appeal system.
Yes.
Right. Like I said, she went to a second trial, and this one ended in a hung jury. And I think possibly it's hard for a jury to believe that a young girl with a good home was responsible for this type of brutality, especially when there's a young male involved. It's probably easier to place the blame on him. But in her third and final trial, Kelly Ellard was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of day parole after serving 7 years of her sentence. So she, in the end, got the exact same sentence as co-defendant Warren Glowatsky.
And thank you for reminding me that this is in Canada, because I think they would have gotten much harsher sentences if it was in the United States.
Of course, we have to look at the difference country by country. Now, that's really where we wound up in terms of the perpetrators and their sentencing. But before we get into our discussion of why this happened, I want to take a minute to explain the moral panic phenomena of the late 1990s, which might help place some of this in context.
I'm sorry, you just didn't say if Kelly ever got paroled. Did she get parole like Warren did?
Yes, I'm saving that for a little bit.
Oh, on purpose. Okay, sorry.
Giving you a reason to hang in here, Amy.
Okay.
But good question. Now I know you're really paying attention. No, I'm kidding. So there have been some moral panic errors in our own country, and, quote, criminal juveniles and females and satanic rituals have kind of been at the center of some of these panics, marked by an increased and heightened anxiety in the general public about this. Remember, super predators and girls, who are now inherently more violent and satanic panic, which I teach a couple of classes on even in my regular courses. Now, in Canada, they were also experiencing a moral panic about the female juvenile offender in the late 1990s. Oftentimes, a panic isn't necessarily about what it seems, but there's an underlying cause. So briefly, I'm just going to touch on what the causes were here in Canada at the time. Maybe similar to here, there was a change in social norms that went from domestic roles of females to increasing rights and representation in the workforce. Remember, the 1970s and 80s were really a time for Canada and for the United States where women started to step into the workforce, but also the 1980s were victim rights movements, equality in pay, equality in the justice system. So I think that these changes scare people. And they equate these changes with sinister outcomes of the feminist movement, you might say. So that was my long way of saying this feminist movement people might see as a negative thing. Now, the media sensationalized girl power in many ways, representing it as female strength. But this strength also, if you think about it, threatens a historically patriarchal society. So if you think about it, this makes sense, right? In terms of how society responds to major changes in the system that were historically, let's say, racist, sexist, homophobic. What the system really does is to penalize these groups at first. And therefore, the punishments or new laws that they make people think that this group is inherently more criminal instead of what the real explanation is, and that's that the policies are changing. So now we're penalizing certain groups for gaining more power, for gaining more equal footing. And then in response, there's a policy to make things more punitive for them.
I mean, you saw this with, Jim Crow, well, black codes, then Jim Crow, then what's considered the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration.
Absolutely. We've seen historical proof of this time and time again. So the progress that we make always comes with a price before it happens. And Reena may have been an unfortunate victim of this price as these teenage girls were dealing with kind of fluctuating societal norms. They had to deal with this in their own ways. And some of these ways were brutal. I mean, for Reena, it was trying to find freedom and autonomy from a strict household that was also upholding their own norms, right? And some of them were patriarchal norms and very strict and very religious. And she's trying to find her own freedom in a time where other females are gaining that, and she doesn't have that. Now, for the 6, perhaps the moral panic actually inspired them to become the female perpetrators that society so feared. Or the 7, the actual perpetrators here might have had an opposite effect. Or perhaps there was no effect on them at all. I just wanted to point out that I think the context here is there was a moral panic about females as the super predators. Now, when we turn to why this happened, I think we can discuss both victimization and offending here. On victimization, Reena was unfortunately alone at night. As we know, she was targeted for a planned attack. She was already the target. There was no capable guardianship, and so this made her a very suitable target for many motivated offenders. People can become the victims in their daily routines when these factors kind of just collide naturally. I know that we covered routine activities in a couple of recent cases as well. Maybe Jennifer Levin was one of them. And while it doesn't explain the motivations, that's what I'll turn to next, the motivations of the offenders, because routine activities is simply just assuming that everyone's a motivated offender, right? It's kind of hard for people like us to accept.
Well, I don't think it assumes everyone's a motivated offender, because I think it's explaining why certain people are motivated, whether it be, young people who are more motivated because their brains haven't developed yet, or somebody who might be down on their luck, right? That's how I always understood it.
Well, I understood it to mean that everyone can have their own motivation, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
As I was taught it anyway, routine activities just assumes you might have a motivation that's completely different from mine, but we all possibly have motivations to commit crime no matter what it is.
Yeah, and I guess it kind of goes along with the idea that rationality is in the eye of the beholder the same way motivation is.
Exactly.
Yeah, I got you.
So, again, we could just start geeking out, but we won't. Sorry. So let's discuss, there's a victimization, but there's also attacks by groups, and especially those who are younger. We've also covered this in cases where group mentality is taken over, especially when an attack is only initiated by 1 or 2 perpetrators. In this case, I believe you have a number of very unhappy, unfortunately dysfunctional and misguided young girls who likely saw an attack on another as an outlet for their own anger. Then you enter the group mentality, or what we call mob mentality, and where members of the group, they're trying to impress each other. There's an excitement factor. There's also kind of not an anonymity, but a factor where they don't have to worry as much. They're not the focus because the whole group is in on this. They were under the influence of alcohol, and there was some drugs. I don't know what specific drugs or who was under the influence. I'm pretty sure most of them were under the influence of some substance. So they kind of lose themselves in this group mentality, and they don't feel the same culpability, which it doesn't diminish your culpability, but it does explain how they egg each other on and how the event escalates so quickly and brutally.
Yeah.
So you have the mob mentality here.
Unfortunately, also, it didn't have a lot to lose, this group, it seems like.
No, they did not. And they probably felt like they didn't have a lot to lose because, again, these were troubled girls. But now you have to turn to the main perpetrators. Now, Warren, while it's difficult to assess his motivations when it comes to the second attack on Reena, or even the first, because he didn't know her, and he was an outlier. He was a male in this attack. He was also a male with gang ties who had been jumped in himself. He had been victimized. He had also been kind of left by his family just recently. That had happened. I think he was desensitized to violence, and I think he was an angry kid who at the time under the influence saw someone weaker than him and a real easy outlet for his own anger, to be honest. That's what I think happened with him. For me, Kelly is by far the most interesting offender because on the surface, she was raised in the best of environments here. On the surface, yes. But I have to tell you, Kelly, based on her behavior, her lies, her manipulation, severe lack of empathy or remorse, very cold and callous. She went after Reena a second time when there was absolutely no reason to. Remember, this was over. This attack, it was over. She followed Reena, and she also, from what we know, convinced Warren to follow Reena. I think Kelly is clearly has sociopathic or psychopathic tendencies, and I think it's obvious.
I had a feeling that's where you were going once you started listing off some of the traits. I mean, at the very least, she has a personality disorder, I think.
Extreme antisocial personality. I mean, and I also think she was born bad. I don't know how to explain it, but I think Kelly was born this way.
Something biological. Yeah.
Yeah, I do. I think it's biological with her.
Whereas Warren's the opposite, right? It's almost like Warren seems like he was someone who could have had potential had he been given a supportive environment. Whereas for her, she might have ended up, being violent regardless of the environment she's put in.
I think so. For me, it goes some way that Warren felt really remorseful. And I know that. And I know his remorse. I mean, of course, I don't know that. He could have been faking remorse. Yes. But it seemed pretty genuine, the way he wanted to make amends with the family. And I don't think Kelly was ever remorseful. I don't think Kelly ever felt bad about what she did.
Well, what happened to Kelly? What did Kelly do after prison?
All right. Here we go. Let's get to it. It's like I said, I think that Warren was punished, reformed, and possibly rehabilitated. However, Kelly might be a different story. So what did happen to Kelly Ellard? Well, she began serving her prison term in 2005. Remember, she had a couple of trials, so it was later. And she was subsequently denied day parole in 2016. According to most reports, it was at this hearing that she first expressed any remorse for the murder of Reena. Though I don't know exactly what she said or did, I don't think she was believed. And this was, again, the only time that had been documented that she had expressed remorse. Kelly also had, just so you know, some infractions in prison that related to drug use. And there were some other minor infractions. I don't believe anything too seriously, but still worth noting. She was granted day parole beginning in 2017, changing her name at the time and since having 2 children.
Okay.
So from what I know, she's not on full parole as of yet, although I think she's approaching that. But she was able on day parole. Remember, you are allowed to leave. You can have a job. And I know that she has, again, 2 children now. She terrifies me, just so you know. Kelly is one of those offenders that absolutely terrifies me. I'd be terrified to come into contact with her. I think she poses a risk.
Well, you may want to take that out because she's out and about and she might get you. So
I would be very, very concerned to have any type of interpersonal contact with her, because I also think Kelly is one of those rare people who poses a threat to both people she knows and those she does not. I hope I'm wrong. She has 2 children, and yes, she's going to be out in the community, so I hope I'm wrong. Let's turn also to the systematic treatment of Reena and her case. Now, her father wrote a book, and the focus was that if Reena had not been removed from the home by social services without a proper investigation, none of this might have happened. They had a very quick reaction, social services, to pulling her from the home, possibly due to the moral panic at the time, or some might argue that this was the right thing to do, prioritizing a child's safety first and asking questions later. But her family argues that this is where their family was torn apart and Reena fell victim to outside influences. You might possibly see the argument there. But in other cases, we go, why didn't the social services come in and take the child quicker? So,
yeah. Also, I think for the family, it's so hard to wrap your head around your child being violently murdered like that.
Of
that
course.
Maybe it's comforting for him to place the blame systemically.
Well, realize too, he was unfairly prosecuted.
Yes.
He was the victim of a wrongful prosecution. So perhaps they were quick in the legal system to also charge him without really supporting evidence.
Yeah.
Which we would say is highly problematic either way.
Yes.
Well, 25 years later, Reena's case still evokes strong emotions, attention, and conversation. It has been featured in the press in various ways, including Rebecca Godfrey's book, Under the Bridge, which, as I explained earlier, has just been turned into an 8-part series on Hulu. So Rebecca Godfrey grew up in the area and became a writer, which led her to the interest in writing about this story because she was from the area. And she went back and interviewed a lot of the people involved. As I said before, Reena's father wrote a book, but I didn't tell you the title. It's Reena, A Father's Story, which he published in 2008. And again, this was the family's point of view about the social service system. And there were other books written about her case and the violence among young females, which is very interesting to me as well, because it's about the myths and the realities. And I've read some of the books that were focused here in the United States. So
you've also covered many cases that fall into this area.
I have. I realized that as I was talking about this and writing this case, I was like, I have covered a few in this area as well. Sadly, Reena's mother, Suman, died in 2018 after choking at a local cafe, which is really tragic, but not before she and her husband worked very hard at anti-bullying campaigns and really promoting the power of restorative justice programs, sharing their experiences in the system and trying to help other families and children who had similar experiences. If you are interested in learning more about Reena's case, there is certainly a number of ways you can do so through reading, podcasts, books. Her case is one that really still has an impact, and it's really just as relevant now as it was then. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners will have opinions on this case as well, which we look forward to hearing.
I also think cases like Reena have spurred a lot of change with anti-bullying in general.
Sure.
It's certainly not the way it was when I was a child. You know, in the 80s and 90s, bullying is taken very seriously now. And I don't want to say it doesn't happen because it's always going to happen, but it happens far less often than it used to.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more. I think there has such a change on bullying and where we're at and such progress that we've made. Thank you for pointing that out, Amy. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We hope to catch you next time on Women in Crime. Women in Crime is written and hosted by Meghan Sachs and Amy Shlosberg. Our producer is James Varga. Script editing is by Abagail Belcastro. Audio editing is by Siler Burr and Jose Alfonzo, and music is by Desert Media. If you enjoy the show, please remember to follow and leave a review. You can also support the show through Patreon, where you can get access to additional ad-free content such as exclusive full-length episodes, lectures, a book club, and virtual happy hours with Meghan and Amy. For more information, visit patreon.com/womenandcrime. Sources for today's episode include People.com, CBS News, the BBC, Today.com, a journal article from the Canadian Review of Sociology and Anthropology, and the Dateline episode, Bloodlust Under the Bridge.